Okay, this is chapter 6. We're going to talk about the self and personality. As much fun as that's going to be. There you go. Okay, the self and personality. 20 statements test. Well, the first thing we're going to start with is talking about the 20 statements test. 20 statements test is really kind of simple. it's it's a test with just a bunch of lines on it. Okay. The test takes the form of a survey with respondents asked to give up to 20 responses to the prompts "Who am I?" or "I am." It is not mandatory that respondents give 20 answers, but they give as many as they can. So that's it. I mean, it's just a sheet of paper, and each line says, "Who am I?" slash "I am," and then you write a statement after that. Test usually only takes a few minutes. I've given this test in other classes. I don't think I gave it maybe I did. Yeah, I guess I did at Saley, Dene College. But I know I gave it at Ashford. Curious thing, Ashford is an online institution. I taught for their static, they had a static campus in Clinton, Iowa, and I taught there. And by golly, they've been bought out by the University of Arizona. They're starting a global university, and they're going to use the format. They're going to use the platform uh, of uh, of Ashford University. That ought to be interesting. I had a chance to buy stock in the company, but I declined. I didn't like their corporate. I didn't like teach. I liked teaching there. It was really nice. It was really a good bunch of kids. But I didn't like the administration. The administration was money grubbing. They were a for-profit institution. Of course, the U of A. I assume that the U of A is not going to run the thing that way. Anyway, so it doesn't really take very long. Test is unusual and utility. An open question methodology making coding non-straightforward. This has been around for about 60 years. Yeah, about 60 years. Kuhn has stated that responses to the 20 statements test should be grouped in 5 categories. You should look at how they answer things by the social groups and classifications, the ideological beliefs, interests, ambitions, and self-evaluations. That's the 20 statement test. And of course, there are the questions, and you could take it yourself if you like. Who am I? And I am, and just make a statement. I am Dene. I Who am I? I am. I don't know. Anyway, the 20 statements test is one of the most widely used cross-cultural psychological measures. Americans most often mentioned personal traits, attitudes, and abilities, which accounted for 48% of self-description. American pattern is similar to many other Western cultures, Australia, Britain, Sweden, and Canada. There's a reason why I put this lady kissing the camera. It's because this seems to be the selfie way of taking pictures. So when somebody takes a selfie, they pucker up their lips like a fish. And I haven't quite figured that one out yet, but you see a lot of selfies with people with puckered lips. Selfies. I'm not exactly sure why that is something that people do, but maybe you guys can explain it to me. When other cultural groups were given the same measure, the results are very much different. The Maasai and the Samburu of Kenya had only 2% of their self descriptions reflect personal characteristics. 60% of their description encompassed their social membership and their roles. And of course, these are two pictures. The one on top are the Maasai, and the one on the bottom are the Samburu. They are two native groups in two indigenous groups in Kenya. The Maasai and the Samburu pattern of a greater emphasis on roles and memberships appears in cultures from much of the rest of the world, and these cultural differences are already evident among kindergarten children. Cook Islanders, Malaysians, Chinese, Native Americans, other Africans besides the Samburu and the Maasai, Puerto Ricans, Indians, that's people from India, of course, and the Japanese. This is a picture of kindergarten dancers on the Cook Islands, as curious as that is. A Danish study by Ma et al. In 2012 looked at functional MRIs when participants were evaluating personal characteristics. The Danish participants showed no difference in their functional MRIs when they considered their social roles or their personal characteristics. Both involve the medial prefrontal cortex, which is typically activated in self-judgments. And that is a picture. This is the medial prefrontal cortex. That's it right there, medial prefrontal cortex. And that part is lit up when we think about who we are. When the researchers performed the same functional MRI on Chinese participants, their medial prefrontal cortex was only activated when they were considering personal characteristics. When the Chinese thought of their social roles, their temporoparietal junction was activated. This is a region that more typically is involved in understanding other people's beliefs, and that is a temporoparietal junction right here. That's it right there, and that's it right there. As you can see, the prefrontal cortex, medial prefrontal cortex is right here. So this is the part of your brain that you use when you're thinking of trying to understand how other people think. Ma et al. In 2012 suggests that the Chinese participants were more likely thinking about other people's beliefs when they thought about their social roles. In other words, what people have assigned to them. Though we are all individuals, humans are also a highly social species. Social interaction is a continuous balancing act between focusing on our differences and seeking our connection with others. And of course, that is how we operate. We're trying to be good. We're driving the speed limit. That's controlled by others. We are following the traffic laws, of course. We're trying to be nice to people. That's all it has to do with social control. While at the same time, we're trying to fulfill our wants and desires. Marcus and Kitayama first identified the independent view of the self in 1991. Independent individuals experience their identities as largely distinct from their relationships. Independent individuals are self-defining attitudes, their personality traits, their preferences, opinions, abilities, and individual qualities. The self's experiences are rather stable and does not change much from situation to situation. The independent view of self is experienced as self-contained and exists as relatively coherent and inviolate an inviolate entity. Relationships vary and are fluid as individuals tend to be closer to close relations than to distant ones. Individuals with independent identities still feel much closer to in-group than out-group members. However, they do not view them in fundamentally distinct ways. The main bifurcation is between self and non-self, and both in-group and out-group members are non-selves. Marcus and Kitayama in 1991 also identified the interdependent self. The self overlaps quite a bit with an individual's significant relationships. Interdependent individuals are closely connected with others and are not experienced as distinct, unique entities. Interdependent entities are grounded in their relationships with others. Relationships come in a variety of forms, and they require people to take on particular roles, such as father, student, lover, friend, daughter, that govern how they feel and behave toward their relationship partners. And of course, you certainly act differently with your significant other than you do with your mother, with your father, with anyone else in your family. And this is really kind of interesting because over the summer I read a book. It was written in 1920, and it was about the Dene people, and it was really kind of curious because they were having a conversation about what should happen next in a select family group, and the everybody came together. The extended family came together so that they can make this important decision. And one of the it was really kind of curious to me that the people that were blood relatives, they got to weigh in, but the individual that didn't get to weigh in was the father, because the father, of course, it's a matrilineal society, and the father was kind of an outlier. He was allowed to speak, but his words carried no weight. It was really kind of interesting. It's the way of the past. I'm guessing fathers in today's Dene culture probably have a little bit more say in what happens. But at that time, this is in the 1920s, and the book was written about before the 1920s. Um, the father had no say in what happened with his own son. It's really kind of curious. The identity of the interdependent individual is experienced as somewhat fluid in different situations. Depending on the situation and the role that the person occupies in that situation, the person's experience of their self will vary accordingly. In other words, when you're around your parents, you act one way. When you're around your friends, you act another way. When you're around your family, you act a different way. So the people that you have your relationships with, it's not, you don't have just one personality that you show to everybody. You have a different personality when you're around people that you're trying to impress, people that you have more control over. Sometimes you're subordinate to other individuals, sometimes other individuals are subordinate to you, and of course you act differently with those different situations. Relationships with one's in-group members are self-defining for those with interdependent selves. Thus, the people in the in-group assume considerable importance. People do not easily become in-group members, nor do close relationships easily dissipate into out-group relations. Sorry, I was getting a drink. Lemonade. In 2007, Zhu, Zhang, Fan, and Han conducted an interesting functional MRI experiment on Western and Chinese participants. They asked the participants whether select trait adjectives characterize themselves or their mothers. Westerners showed different regions of the brain activation, suggesting that they represent themselves and their mothers in distinct ways. When the Chinese were evaluating themselves or their mothers, they showed activation patterns in the same regions of the two for the two tasks. The medial prefrontal cortex, as we said before, an area linked with self-representations. So the Chinese felt that they were so close to their mothers that they couldn't separate themselves from their mothers. But Westerners, of course, could. Independent selves have a number of close relationships with members of their in-group. However, these relationships are less self-defining than are the corresponding relationships of those with more interdependent selves. Interdependent selves identify more strongly with their in-group, while independent selves have a more permeable relationship. Because in-group relations are so critical for self-definition for people in more interdependent cultures, and because they serve to direct appropriate behaviors, it is especially necessary to identify those with whom one has such significant relationships. A number of years ago, say 2 decades ago or a decade ago, the psychology books would talk about gender identity. They would say that your peers are the ones that force you to act one way or act another way. That's because that in-group, that's because they were so important to you that they were the ones that told you whether you were acting as if you were female or if you were male, or if you were acting too female if you were a male. And they would shame you into acting the way that they wanted you to act. Of course, that is interdependent. Now that the world has changed to some extent, that aspect has changed as well. Now people are more independent with social media, and people's identities have changed. Their concept of identity has changed, so that they're not just identifying themselves with the they the their in group can't control them as much as they did in the past, and we are more. No, that's not right. We are more independent now than we were before. We were more interdependent before. Obligations to others are an important part of in-group relations among interdependent people, so it is of vital importance for them to distinguish those toward whom they have obligations from those that they do not. Becoming a member of an interdependent individual's in-group is thus a rather substantial accomplishment, and such relationships should be entered cautiously. And a good example of this is all the coming of age movies that you've seen. People wanted to become part of the in crowd. They wanted to become part of the popular group. And most of those movies show that just because you become part of that group, it's not the most. It's not always a positive experience. Um, and of course that's, I don't know, that's the message that people are trying to send, that just because you're not popular doesn't mean that you're missed out on anything, or that you missed out on anything good. Now those people have control over you, and of course now you have to do what they did. There was a good movie, um, Can't Buy Me Love. It's an old movie from the 1980s, but it has Patrick Dempsey in it, who later became such an individual that was considered so attractive. Anyway, this movie is really kind of neat because he buys his way into this group by renting, hiring the head cheerleader to pretend to go out with him. Things are going fine, and actually they form a relationship that he doesn't recognize, and then they have to break up because the contract is over with. So they break up, and then he becomes part of the in group. Then eventually, of course, and he becomes very, very popular with these individuals. And then at some New Year's party, or yeah, it was a New Year's party. She gets drunk, and she tells everybody what he did, the fact that he hired her to be his girlfriend. And at that point, they all reject him. In the end, of course, they're because they have such a strong relationship, or such a strong bond between the two of them. Eventually, they come back together. It's, you know, young love always wins in the end, especially in movies, not in real life, of course. But so you have to be careful. You have to be careful as to whether, if you don't know if looking from the outside in, it looks like that's the perfect life, but sometimes that's not true. I had a friend, let's see. Of course, I graduated from high school in the 1960s, and he went right into the factory, made lots of money, became a supervisor. Because all the people did these things at that time, he started snorting cocaine. That was the thing you did if you were an important person. This is in the late 70s, early 80s. Well, in 1985, he had a stroke because he was snorting. The cocaine had it's a vasoconstrictor, and this happens to some people if they snort too much cocaine. He had a stroke, and it really messed him up. You got to be one of the in crowd. You can't make your own way if you're part of that group. Anyway, this is a picture from the movie A Clockwork Orange. Interesting movie, uh, and it has to do with in groups and out groups, and it's really kind of a curious movie. Old movie from the 70s, I think. A more independent person is likely to perceive themselves as existing and functioning separately from the social environment. The environment is more tangential to the independent person's identity. Relationships can be formed and broken without having a large impact on the independent person's identity. In other words, they have a fairly stable identity. The interdependent person, if they lose their friendships, if they have to change things, it changes who they are. They're no longer accepted in society, and that's because they are interdependent with society. They have to be part of that group in order to be accepted. The independent person is actually a healthier person, psychologically, of course. People with independent selves are more willing to form new relationships, maintain larger networks of relationships, and be less distressed should any of these relationships fade away over time. For independent persons, in-groups and out-groups are less consequential to self-construction. And I saw this, I told you that I went to my 50th high school reunion 3 years ago. I was really kind of curious because I haven't really kept contact with anybody from my high school. That was a long time ago. I went away to college, and then I went into the military right away. So I was not in the area for 50 years, literally for 50 years. We moved all over the world and all over the United States. And when we went back, it was really kind of curious because there were some people that had never left. They had just never left. They were afraid to leave. Now there's a lot of what's the word I'm looking for? There's a lot of stability in that. There's a lot. It's a lot easier to be a big fish in a small pond than it is to be a small fish in a big pond. And some people just couldn't handle the idea that they weren't going to be, the head cheerleader anymore, or the star of the basketball team. It's basketball in Indiana. The star of the basketball team is really kind of curious. Those people stayed around. The athletic heroes tended to stay around. I didn't, of course, but it was really kind of interesting. I became a member of the my high school Hall of Fame. And when they announced us, the people that had stuck around, they gave them this. They talked about all their accomplishments. Well, I wrote out all the things that I had done. The fact I had a PhD and all that other stuff. And when they announced me, they hardly said anything at all. And mainly it's because nobody knew me and nobody cared because I had been gone for 50 years. So only the people that cared were the people that I went to high school with. The rest of those people could care less who I was. I was like an alien creature from Mars coming down. And this man ran the 400 and 400-meter dash. Anyway, that's kind of curious. Okay, for independent persons, in-groups and out-groups are less consequential to self-construction. There is convergent evidence of heightened distinction between in-groups and out-groups among those who are more interdependent. The Japanese are very interdependent. The Chinese are very interdependent. They're very collectivistic. Collectivistic cultures, such as the Japanese or the Chinese, richly describe this pronounced difference in behavior between contexts involving in-groups. The uchi, those are your buds, the people that dress and act like you, and those involving out-groups. Those are the soto. And in the United States, everybody comes together. It's all the Breakfast Club, if you've ever seen that movie. All these divergent individuals come together and they form a group. Doesn't happen in Japan. If somebody's not a member of your group, you can't talk to them. You can't interact with them at all. That's just the way it is. You create your own in-groups, and those in-groups are extremely important to you. And you refer to people that aren't like you as soto. Studies have found that Asian Americans were more accurate than European Americans in identifying the emotions experienced by their close friends. Now, this is really kind of interesting. Now, remember, collectivistic cultures, these are your uchi. These are the people that you know best. As a collectivist society, you don't care how the Soto reacts. So even looking at Asian Americans who have been away from their home countries for generations, these people are able to. They still identify with a more collectivistic way of looking at the world. European Americans were more accurate than Asian Americans in identifying emotions that were experienced by strangers, and this is research by Mock Helms and Blaskovich in 2012. As curious as that is, so what's happening here? Well, European Americans are more independent. They come from a less collectivistic society. So when we look at people, we actually see everybody. We don't just see our friends. We see and notice everybody. Really kind of interesting because sometimes I would be standing in line at Walmart or whatever, and I would notice everybody. It's not like I'm studying everybody, but I would notice everybody. And if I said to my wife or my daughter or my grandson, did you see that guy that was standing over there? They wouldn't even notice these people. They don't even see people. And of course, I'm a little bit different. People tell me I'm different. In places like Japan, where commitment to in-group members is strong, there should be less of a willingness to cooperate with outgoing members. People with interdependent selves focus their trust on people they share some kind of relationship. Yamagishi and Yamagishi in 1994 found that Americans tend to have higher levels of general trust than the Japanese do. And that's one of the reasons is because we don't just adhere to our in-groups. We look beyond us, and we trust people that are around us. We're not concentrating on just the people that are our friends. Bond and Smith in 1996 found that people with more interdependent views of self are more likely to conform than those with more independent views. This may be because people with more interdependent selves view in-groups members as an extension of themselves while maintaining distance from out-group members. Now, this is really kind of an interesting picture on the left. This is a picture in the 1840s. The United States forced the Japanese to allow them to come to their country. They were a closed country. They would not allow if another country tried to land ships on the Japanese islands, the Japanese would attack them. But in the 1840s, they were looking for trade, is what they were looking for. Europeans were looking for trade. In the 1840s, the United States Navy landed ships in Tokyo Harbor. And this is the way they saw Americans. As you can see, they look almost like some kind of a monster, a hairy monster at that. you, you can see how grouchy they look. And you can look at their ears. Look at his ears. Oh, that individual's barely human. Anyway, that's the way they saw. That's the way they saw Americans. The interlopers, they saw them as hairy monsters. In 1983, IBM tasked psychologist Gert Hofstede to assess their employees' opinions and interests. Hofstede administered questionnaires to 117,000 employees. This is the IBM Corporation in 40 different countries. Hofstede was able to map the individualism of all the employees in each country. The country scores show a clear and striking pattern. Remember, there's 40 different countries, and he was looking at 117,000 IBM employees. Hofstede discovered that the most individualistic country in the world is, surprise, surprise, the United States, closely followed by other English-speaking countries and by Western European nations. Countries, and of course that's a picture of one of the Kardashians, Kim, I think, taking a selfie. Countries that scored high in collectivism were various nations in Latin America and Asia. Other research has found similar results. Collectivism has been found to dominate in Asia, Africa, Southern Europe, Eastern Europe, and the South Pacific. Of course, you don't remember this. You don't know about this because you weren't alive at the time. But in the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, there were no member. There were of the members of the Supreme Court, none had ever been Catholic. Um, we had never elected a Catholic president. Our first Catholic president was John F. Kennedy. He was elected president in 1960. So it took that many years. And the reason, the rationale behind rejecting people who were Catholic was the fact that the Catholic countries are mostly in Southern Europe and Eastern Europe. That's one of the reasons that they rejected them. The idea was that Catholics would do what the Pope told them to do. That was the idea. That's the basis of the religion. I have an aunt who was an evangelist, and she used to preach against Catholicism. Uh, she would tell people. She also preached against just about every other religion you can imagine. She really disliked Jewish people, and she disliked Catholics. So she would preach against them. Of course, I always thought she was nutty as a fruitcake, so I didn't really listen to her. An example is when I was a kid. When I was a kid, I just liked football, Okay, so I'm from Indiana, and Indiana has three major schools: Notre Dame, Purdue, and Indiana University. And I of the three, and none of them were any good back in the 50s and 60s. Purdue had a couple good teams, but Notre Dame stunk back then, and so did Indiana. Anyway, so of the three, I picked Notre Dame because I liked the name. It wasn't that their colors were anything that I was really excited about. But so I created this pennant that said Notre Dame on it, and I put it on my wall. And my aunt was visiting our house one day. Uh, one weekend, she made this big appearance, and she was walking through, looking at everything. And she walked through my bedroom, and I had that pennant on the wall. It was handmade. I made it myself. She ripped it off the wall and tore it up because Notre Dame. And I didn't know the difference between one school and the other. I just liked their football team. I didn't realize they were something horrible that she rejected. Anyway, my mother got mad at her and told her not to do that kind of thing, and she said, you know these religious arguments. Anyway, she never came back to our house. Most people participate in collectivistic cultures where interdependent selves are more common. These countries encompass more than 80% of the world's population, and of course, that includes all of the rust brown here. All the yellow countries are the ones that are more independent. England and Germany and Austria. This is France. France is Catholic, and so is Spain. And for that reason, they're more collectivistic. The state with the highest collectivism score by far was Hawaii, and it's probably because of that state's large population of people with Asian ancestry. A lot of what happened was Hawaii was an island that was taken. Eventually, it was taken over by the United States. Had a relatively large indigenous population, so they decided that they were going to grow sugarcane and pineapple. Of course, sugarcane and pineapple both require a lot of attention, and so they brought people over from China and Japan and the Philippines to work in the fields, and eventually they kind of replaced the indigenous population. There still is an indigenous population on Hawaii. I don't want you to think that there isn't. But they would bring over the cheap labor that they could find, and that was in the beginning it was Japan and the Philippines and the Chinese. Eventually, they brought over Portuguese. It's really kind of an interesting mix. Going to Hawaii is really kind of fascinating, and looking at the people out there. This is Diamond Head. This is Honolulu, and that's why the Waikiki Beach is that beach right there. The next most collectivistic states were Utah and the states of the Confederate South. The Confederate South included Tennessee, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Texas, Arkansas, and Florida and Louisiana. Those were the Confederate states, more collectivistic than the North. The least collectivistic states were in the Mountain West, the Great Plains, the Northeast, and the Midwest. And of course, all those states stayed loyal to the Union during the Civil War. Individualism varies as a function of social class. Specifically, people from higher socioeconomic backgrounds tend to have more independent selves than those from poorer backgrounds within the same country. And the reason that they are more independent is because they can afford to be as independent as they want to be. If you are a worker and you rely on your job for survival, you're probably not going to tell your boss to go stick a corn cob up his butt. Probably not. Wealthier Icelandic children tend to describe themselves more in terms of inner psychological traits than poor Icelandic children do. The poorer you are, the less freedom you have to describe yourself in a way that might make somebody angry. Middle class American parents emphasize the importance of self direction to their children, whereas working class American parents place greater value on conforming to authority figures. Now, this is really kind of important because in the last election, the everybody was surprised that as many people as did voted for Donald Trump. And his base turned out to be working class people, which was a bit of a surprise that they went that they voted so heavily for Donald Trump, mainly because he's he's got billions and billions of dollars, and he's always been a wealthy person. So how in the world can he identify with the working class? And the answer was that the working class they like authority figures, and a lot of the things that he has done since he's been president of the United States have been fairly authoritarian. He's just changed laws, uh, ignoring Congress and whatnot. And this is what select individuals like. They like to be told what to do, and that's the working class Americans. They're used to it. They grow up that way. That's the only way they can maintain their jobs. Middle class people a little bit more flexible. Interdependent messages are a better fit with American students from working class backgrounds. Some of the highest concentrations of universities in the United States are in the Northeast and the Midwest, where individualism is more pronounced. This is areas where people wanted to move out of the working class. They wanted to move into the middle class. That was, you bought your own house. That was something that you wanted to do. If you were working class, you didn't make enough money to own your own home. But if you're middle class, if you can make it into the middle class, then you can buy your own house. That's part of the American dream. And because of that, the Northeast and the Midwest, just tons and tons of schools. Indiana has 21 schools, and 5 of them are large, and the rest of them are these small liberal arts colleges. Ohio's the same way. Michigan's the same way. We just had the Arizona transfer meeting for psychology. It was really kind of curious. Looking at the colleges in Arizona, there are 3 major universities. NAU, ASU, and the U of A are the three major. The rest of them are community colleges. There are no other four-year colleges except for Diné College. And we had to tell them, I had to tell them that we had become a four-year institution, that we were awarding a bachelor's degree. They were shocked. They were surprised because this isn't something that colleges in Arizona strive for. But if you go to another state with fewer people in it, Montana, for example, Montana has six major colleges, four-year institutions, and not very many community colleges, but they have seven tribal colleges in Montana, which are mostly they're all community colleges except for Salish Kootenai as a four-year program. It's just different. I mean, it's really kind of strange that there aren't more four-year institutions in Arizona. There's only four, counting us. It's just really weird. But if you go to the Northeast, Ohio, that's the Midwest. If you go into the Northeast, Massachusetts and Maine, and they've got just tons and tons of four-year institutions, and hardly any community colleges. And of course, like I said, Indiana has only one community college. It's all over the state, but there's only one community college. And the rest of them are these small liberal arts colleges, Butler and Wabash and DePaul. I mean, they're just all over the state. Indianapolis, University of Indianapolis is a four-year institution. It used to be in Indiana Central. Anyway, it's just a different mindset. So the more individualism you have, the more of these colleges and universities that you have, because you have more middle class people. Psychological research within the United States has been largely conducted with participants who are even more individualistic than most other Americans. The reality is that most of our psychological research is done at colleges. So we have a certain percentage of people who are working class, and we have a certain percentage of people who are middle class. Well, almost all of our psychological research is looking at upper and middle class people, not in working class people, because they don't go to college. Or if they do go to college, they go to a two-year institution. And of course, we very rarely do research at a two-year institution. It's always at a four-year institution, or a school with a graduate school. Other cultural dimensions that researchers have investigated include societal tightness versus looseness. Societal tightness characterizes how strong cultural norms are and how tolerant cultures are of deviant behavior. This predicts level of prevention focus, impulse control, and self-regulation. So that's one of the things that we look at. The Northeast, of course, when we're talking about the Puritans, they hung witches, something that very few places do. However, if we look at the Quaker religion, the Quakers didn't believe in capital punishment. And here we have the Puritans in Massachusetts that were hanging people because of this concept of them being witches. Another cultural dimension that has been investigated are cultural values. Values for universalism, for benevolence, for conformity, for tradition, security, power, achievement, hedonism, stimulation, and self-direction. So when you take social psychology, one of the things that you're going to do is look at cultural values, and you're going to concentrate on all of these cultural values. Other cultural dimensions that have been investigated: power distance, uncertainty, avoidance, vertical, horizontal social structure, relationship structure, context dependence, social cynicism, and complexity. And you'll probably talk about these things as well in social psychology. One of the difficulties in studying cultural psychology is that individuals tend to be varied and complex. Cultures are highly variable and are resistant to categorization. Sorry, I was getting another drink. All cultures are highly heterogeneous and contain a great variety of people. Cultural differences this book describes reflect general patterns of differences and not all or nothing statements. The reality is that we can't talk about a group of people as if they all acted alike. We can't do that. We can't talk about people from Diné College and say the typical Diné College student looks like this and they act like this. That just doesn't work. People have different ideas. They come from different families. Different families have different values. So it's just impossible. A number of researchers have identified women as more interdependent than men. The features of independent entities seem more characteristic of men than of women. There are issues of gender equality in most cultures, and of course, this is kind of an interesting cartoon. The lady from the West says everything covered but her eyes. What a cruel male-dominated culture. And the lady from the Islamic lady from the East says nothing covered but her eyes. What a cruel male-dominated culture she comes from. And that's actually the way people think in different cultures. They see things, and this is one of the reasons why sometimes it's difficult to get people to negotiate or to talk, is because all of their values are just so completely different. Doesn't make one wrong and the other right. It just means that they are different. Women represent only 3% of elected officials in Arab nations. Women represent 45% of the Swedish parliament. In Brazil, 50% of the men and women are literate. In Pakistan, twice as many men are literate as women. And this was a big deal. This is a big deal as since we have been fighting in Afghanistan since 9/11. One of the things that we noticed there was the fact that traditional Islam, Sharia law, sometimes doesn't allow women. The very strict interpreters of Sharia law doesn't allow women to be educated. And of course, this has been a huge conflict or negotiating point that we've had difficulty with dealing with Pakistan, which is supposed to be our allies in Afghanistan. You'll remember the young lady that won the Peace Prize, and I can't think of her name right off the top of my head. She was shot in the head because she wanted to go to school, and she was petitioning the local school district to allow girls to go to school, and she was shot in the head by the Taliban. And now, of course, we're negotiating with the Taliban. She won the International Peace Prize 2 years ago, I think. Anyway, she was, I think Malala. Anyway, I apologize that I didn't look this up before. Before I started this lecture. In the Netherlands, Germany, and Finland, on the average, people express views that men and women should be treated quite similarly. That's what the Western way of looking at things. However, in India, Pakistan, and Nigeria, people tended to believe that roles, obligations, and rights of men and women are clearly different, with men being perceived to have more rights than women. A lot of times it has to do with religion. Some religions, the Quaker religion, for example, the Quaker religion allows women to be ministers, but in some Protestant churches, women cannot preach to men. That's the Baptist church. Women are not allowed to proselytize to men, as curious as that is. And of course, the traditional religions, Christianity, the Jewish religion, Hinduism, Muslimism, Buddhism, all of these are male-dominated religions, and the female is to a degree subordinate. Within a culture, men and women tended to share fairly similar views about gender equality. In India, Pakistan, and Nigeria, women tended to embrace the gender attitudes of their respective countries. The reality is, when women dress like this, it's not because it's because they are religious and because they want to go to heaven just like everybody. I mean, just like most people want to go to whatever heaven they adhere to. But their idea is the more traditional that they are, the more likely that they will be successful in going to heaven. And the same way with these women. These women are from Pakistan, I believe. They didn't cover their faces. I think this picture was taken by a woman, and that's why. And of course, in some Muslim countries, the women have to cover everything but their eyes, and in other places they don't. It all depends on the culture that we're dealing with. In every case except two reversals in Malaysia and Pakistan, males have a significantly more traditional gender view than females, probably because traditional gender views benefit men more than women. Of course, this has been something that we have argued about. Ruth Bader Ginsburg died yesterday. I'm doing this lecture on the 19th. She died on the 18th of September. When she first started in law, she was one of the only female members of her law class. Men and she was told that she couldn't do this, she couldn't do that, and of course eventually she became Supreme Court Justice. And she's a hero to many women because she would not allow men to force their traditional values on her, and because of that, other women have been empowered to to be more independent and to reject the older rules. Now, you go, well, come on, it's not that bad. Well, yeah, look, this is what we're talking about. This is a Van Heusen tie advertisement from the 1950s, and as you can see, the woman's on her knees feeding her husband in bed. That was an advertisement, and that was supposed to sell ties to men. If you wear a Van Heusen tie, your wife will be subordinate to you, and she'll, feed you breakfast in bed and whatnot. This was an idea back in the 1950s, and this is when Ruth Bader Ginsburg went to law school in the 1940s and 1950s. This was what the United States looked like. This picture right here is what it looked like. Women were forced to wear gloves. They had to always wear hats. They had to wear gloves. They had to wear dresses. They couldn't wear slacks. It was just the way things were back then. And of course, things change in time. Everything evolves, and so we are less traditional than we were before. And we can thank people like Ruth Bader Ginsburg for breaking those barriers, breaking the chains, and breaking the glass ceiling as best that she could. Countries in which a large percentage of the population practiced Christianity, in particular Protestantism, were more likely to have egalitarian gender views, whereas countries with a large percentage of Muslims were associated with more traditional gender views. And of course, if we look at the difference between Protestantism and Catholicism, we can see that France is really kind of an interesting country because France is mostly Catholic, but they have a more egalitarian way of looking at things, and the church doesn't run anything in France. So they are very independent people in France. But if we look at other Catholic countries, South America, Spain, Eastern Europe, Southern Europe, we see more traditional countries. Oddly, more northern countries express more egalitarian views, and more southern countries express more traditional gender views. The more urbanized the country, the more likely the country will have egalitarian views. A country's individualism score correlated positively with egalitarian views. One way to look at gender and culture is to determine which gender identity is viewed to be more essentialized, which gender is thought to reflect an underlying unchangeable essence, which gender has less flexible ways of being expressed in a socially approved way. And a way to look at this is who gets to wear, if we look at males and females, even on the reservation, if we look at males and females, of course, if you're dressed for a ceremony, then the females wear long dresses down to the ground, and the males wear jeans. But if we go to college, I mean, if we're going to Diné College, and we look at all the students in the classroom, from time to time, you'll see a young lady with a dress on. But normally it's females wearing jeans and wearing slacks, wearing pants, just like the males do. Sometimes they wear almost identical clothes, the males and the females. So who is the more essentialized? Well, the answer would be that males are more essentialized because when was the last time you saw a man wearing a dress? But when was the last time you saw a woman wearing slacks? The answer is that you never see a man wearing a dress. As a matter of fact, I'm going to show you a picture of a man wearing a dress and just see how wrong that seems. But I'm going to show you other pictures of females wearing more masculine clothes. And of course, that is acceptable. So the male gender is more essentialized in Western culture. There you go. There's a guy with a dress on. As attractive as that is, Americans tend to view male gender identity to be more essentialized than female gender identity. Most Americans do not seem to find it disturbing or unusual for women to present themselves like men, wearing pants, having short hair, not wearing facial makeup, or participating in stereotypically male behaviors, girls playing with trucks or girls playing ice hockey. We don't worry about that. Well, we're going to talk about that. Okay. So this doesn't look right, and that you wouldn't see this. But a lady wearing hockey clothes and playing hockey, who cares? Nobody. It doesn't bother anybody. Many Americans do find it disturbing or unusual for men to present themselves as women, wearing dresses, high heels, or lipstick, or to participate in stereotypically female behaviors, playing with dolls, or taking ballet lessons. Male identity is less changeable and thus more essentialized. And it bothers people. They worry about males when they start if they play with dolls, or if they put on makeup, or if they start wearing dresses, or if they start changing their clothes. If they wear, bright clothes or dark clothes or whatever, if they have clothes that aren't the same as everybody else's, as weird as that may seem. My grandson last year, when he had his school picture taken, he wore a hat, and the photographer tried to get him to take it off, but he said he wanted his picture taken in a hat. And so it's just a hat. It's a fedora, it's just a hat. So when his dad saw the picture, his dad got mad because he thought that it made his son look not normal. He thought it made him look gay, and he got upset about it. The fact that his son was wearing a hat, and so when my daughter and the baby daddy don't live together. As a matter of fact, he's down in Florida. My daughter's up here in Iowa. When he went down to visit him, his father gave him a long conversation. He had a long conversation about not doing something like that, only doing what everybody else does. So that he doesn't want him to be gay, and that's what he saw in the picture. In Hindu myths, many more male gods change into female goddesses than female goddesses change into gods. The Hindu religion involves goddess worship, and many of the most powerful gods are female: Kali, Parvati, Durga, and Maya. According to the Hindu religion, female identity is viewed as pure, strong, and powerful, In India, the male gender identity was more mutable and less essentialized than the female gender. When Westerners started wandering all over the world, saying that they owned everything, when they came to this area, when they came to, especially to the southeast, they had a difficult time. Well, when they came to Dene Bazad, they had a difficult time um, identifying who was in charge. They wanted to find out who was in charge so that they could capture them and control them. But they, it's just not the way you guys do things. And not only that, but they were looking for the male that was in charge. They had landed in the southeast, and one of the tribes of the southeast, especially the Cherokee, the Chickasaw, and the Choctaw, they're all matrilineal. So are the Shawnee. They're matrilineal as well, and they had a difficult time understanding this. They wanted the power structure of the indigenous people that they were dealing with to be exactly the same as theirs. So they were looking for a male leader, and they couldn't always find that. They had the same problem in India when the British tried to conquer India. They just befuddled them. They had no idea what was going on. Kali, this is what Kali looks like. Oh, did I finish that? In India, the male gender identity was more mutable and less essentialized than the female gender. The female gender is essentialized in India. Now there's Kali, the female. Kali, probably the most powerful uh, goddess in the pantheon. There's What's what Parvati looks like. Everybody's got too many arms. Okay. There's Durga, and there's Maya. Festinger in 1957 proposed that people have a powerful motivation to be consistent, and their cognitive dissonance is the distressing feeling that we have when we observe ourselves acting inconsistently. So if you were acting inconsistently, if if you're a male and wanted to wear a dress in the 1950s, of course, that would cause you cognitive dissonance. The belief that we can easily change and are expected to change is referred to as an incremental theory of self. Traits are malleable and can be improved. Aspects of, and of course, this comes we see this when in a situation where somebody is an alcoholic. Oh, it's easy to change. You just have to, all of your traits are malleable, and we can improve you. You just need to be like everybody else. That's the idea, anyway. Aspects of the self are largely resistant to change, which is known as an entity theory of self. Individuals with this view see their attributes to be largely inborn. In other words, they're genetic. So we're born the way that we're going to die. We have our personality traits are those traits. And of course, there is the entity and the incremental self theory. The incremental self theory is that you can change over time, and the entity theory is that your intelligence is set, that you cannot change, that nothing you can do, you can do nothing to help yourself. Now, this becomes very important when we start talking about education, because in the Western world, we have the entity theory of education. The idea is that you can't change yourself, that you will always be the same. This is one of the reasons why we give IQ tests. Um, I'm not going to tell you the story about my IQ, but the idea is that, and I took an IQ test when I was in the first grade. My goodness gracious. I was 5 years old at the time, and here I am taking an IQ test. And from that IQ test, they put me in different classes because I took this test. Now, I took that test every year, but that has to do with something else. Most of the individuals only took it once. They only took it when they're in the first grade. And from that IQ test that they took in the first grade, they guided them through the rest of their high school career, the rest of their school career. Research found that, but that's in the Western world. In the Eastern world, it's different. Research found that 60% of the Chinese high school students said that the key to success in math is to study hard. If you don't get it, then the harder you study, then the more likely you'll be able to get it. In contrast, less than 25% of American high school students felt this way. Japanese believe more than Americans that intelligence is based on how hard you try rather than on what they are born with. Now let me tell you a quick story about IQ. I have the people in my family test really well, and so I have cousins that tested in the genius level with these astronomical IQs. Now you would think that if you got this really high IQ, then you would be helped along, you'd be massaged along in school. But these individuals became more and more temperamental, and they started arguing with their teachers. And I have a family of geniuses, my cousins, uh, my second cousins actually, they're not my first cousins. These individuals were so smart that they dropped out of school in the eighth grade. They didn't need any more schooling. They didn't do anything for the rest of their lives. Now, when they created the IQ test, the IQ test just tells you how your potential for learning. That's all it does. That's all the IQ test is. It doesn't say you're going to be extremely successful. You've got to still have the drive to do it. So this is one of the aspects of being intelligent in the Western world. It doesn't mean that you're going to become president of the United States. And of course, this used to happen. I was when first started teaching. I was teaching in high school, and I was in charge of the gifted and talented program. And half of my students that were in the gifted and talented program, half of my students were real aggressive and they made A's. The other half made C's and D's, and sometimes you had to beg them to try so that they would pass a test. I mean, half of them were just didn't do anything. It was so frustrating. They had so much potential, and they decided not to use it. When I was in high school, we had a lot of really smart kids in my grade, in my class, and one of the smartest kids was a really good friend of mine, and he decided he would rather be a hippie, and his goal in life was to drink himself to death. And eventually, at 39, he died of alcoholism. As stupid as that is, this guy had this astronaut. He had 165 IQ. He was brilliant. He could learn anything, but instead he decided that he wasn't going to do that. Anyway, it's a waste. To get into a good American university, you typically need to get an acceptable score on the SAT test. The SAT was, well, actually, the T stands for test. The SAT was originally designed to measure innate aptitudes and not efforts in one's classes. It turns out that studying hard can increase one's SAT score significantly. This has been a source of frustration for test makers because the tests are no longer serving the function that they were originally designed for, which has sparked much policy debate about their utility. SAT tests were aptitude tests. You have an aptitude for this or you have an aptitude for that. Can I get into this graduate school? IQ tests are regularly given, even to this day, they're regularly given in public schools in the United States. And the results influence decisions on whether students should attend gifted or remedial classes. As weird as that is, IQ tests. Now, that's not the purpose of the IQ test, but that's what happens, and that's what happened in when I was going to school. Most of the kids that didn't score very high on the IQ test were guided toward becoming factory workers or guided toward becoming farmers. The ones that had high IQs were guided in that direction as well, but we were supposed to be their supervisors. I grew up in what is now known as the Rust Belt because all those factories have closed. But at that time, of course, all those factories were open and they needed as many workers as they could get. And so they were educating us to be factory workers. In Japan, to get into a good university, you need to do well on university entrance exams that test your mastery of a large amount of material. The Japanese bar exam to become a lawyer is notoriously difficult. Only 2.5% of people pass it every year, and those who do, on average, have failed failed the exam 4 times before ultimately succeeding. Approximately 2/3 of those taking the American bar exam each year pass it, with about 3/4 of them passing it on the first attempt. 2.5% in Japan. That may be one of the reasons why there are so few lawyers in Japan. The five-factor model of personality started out as a personality profile test developed to test U.S. Air Force officers in the 1950s. And it was developed by Tupes and Crystal in 1961. And they were working for the RAND Corporation, the Research and Development Corporation. They're out of Santa Monica. The whole idea of coming up with the five-factor model of personality had to do with finding good Air Force officers, finding people that could be good leaders in the Air Force, finding people that you could put in an airplane and they wouldn't cave, they wouldn't have a problem fighting and flying. Tupes and Crystal used factor analysis to determine which of Cattell's 16 personality factors were significant. Now remember, they're looking for officers with the right personalities to be good pilots and to be good officers. They came up with 5 that factored as most important over and over again. Now this is the 16 factors that personality factors that Cattell looked at, and these were the factors that they were trying to whittle down to find out which ones were the most important for Air Force officers. Warmth, reasoning, emotional stability, dominance, liveliness, rule consciousness, social boldness, sensitivity, vigilance, abstractedness, privateness, apprehension, openness to change, self-reliance, perfectionism, and tension. Now, if you were going to describe an Air Force officer, which 5 of those would be the most important? And these are the ones they came up with: openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. So the 5-factor model of personality involves these 5 factors. Openness to experience reflects a person's intelligence and curiosity about the world. You want your officers to be intelligent and curious. Conscientiousness indicates how responsible and dependable an individual is. Now, let me tell you about being in the military. In the military, you move around a lot. And if you have to stay in one place, then the military is not good for you, is not right for you. You need to have curiosity about the world. And that's where the openness of experience comes in. Conscientiousness indicates how responsible and dependable an individual is. Of course, that's what you want your military officers to be. Extroversion indicates how much an individual is active and dominant. And of course, that's what you want your officers to be as well, active and dominant. Agreeableness is the extent to which a person tends to be warm and pleasant. So you need to be active and dominant and warm and pleasant at the same time. Not the easiest thing in the world. In order to get people to follow you, active and dominant is important, but you better be warm and pleasant or they're not going to stick with you. And the last is neuroticism. Neuroticism is the degree to which an individual can be seen as emotionally stable and unpredictable. And of course, you want your officers to be emotionally stable and predictable. So there you go. Those are the 5 personality factors that Tupes and Crystal came up with. Wasn't his name Crystal? Yeah, Crystal. Okay. The 5-factor model proposes that all personality traits largely reflect some combination of these 5 core traits. All personality traits should show significant correlations with at least one, if not more, of these core traits. The five factors can be seen to reflect basic structure of personality. There is a question as to how well the five-factor structure generalizes elsewhere. Now, this works for us in the United States. This works for the United States military. It worked for the Air Force. Did it work for, could you use this model on the Army, Marines, or Navy? And the answer was yes. So they started using the five-factor model when they were looking at officers. So you could be disqualified from being an officer if you didn't fit this model, this five-factor model. If you weren't open to experience, if you weren't conscientious, weren't extroverted, you weren't agreeable, you were neurotic. You're looking for anti-neuroticism is actually what you're looking for. An analysis of indigenous Chinese personality trait terms found a set of factors that were not the same as the Big Five. Now remember, the Big Five, they're not just independent, they're also the leaders of independence, in essence. So the Chinese, of course, are very collectivistic, very much different than we are in the United States because of their collectivism. Four factors emerged that were captured by the following labels. So they had the Big Five plus four other factors. And those four factors were dependability. Remember, they are collectivistic, so they need to be able to get along with everybody around them. Dependability, reflecting responsibility, optimism, and trustworthiness. Of course, that fits being collective, being from a collectivist society. Interpersonal relatedness, reflecting harmony, thrift, relational orientation, and tradition. Of course, that you would need that in a collectivist society as well. Social potency, reflecting leadership, adventurousness, and extroversion. And that fits collectivism as well. You need people to take charge from time to time, and you never know who it's going to be. And individualism, reflecting logical orientation, defensiveness, and self-orientation. As surprising as that is, that one doesn't really fit. Similar approaches have been taken in other cultures. Researchers looking at Filipino personality traits discovered two additional traits to the Big Five. In the Philippines, and these are people from the Philippines, this is what people from the Philippines look like, temperamentalness. Temperamentalness is like, think of that little kid in Walmart who lays down on the floor and kicks his legs. That's what temperamentalness is. It's being spoiled. That's what they look for in their leaders. And if we look at Duarte, who is the leader of the Philippines right now, this is what we see, this strange temperamentalness and negative valence dimension. In other words, they want them to be grouchy. They want them to be angry. They want them to show all these negative ideas. And that was something that they saw in the Philippines. And of course, we see this with Duarte. We saw it with Marcos. Right after World War II, Marcos became president of the Philippines. And he was a president for decades. He and his wife, and they did some really ugly things. But that was what they were looking for. They were looking for these two personality traits along with the Big Five. An investigation of 11 different language groups in South Africa revealed 9 underlying factors, some of which overlapped with the Big Five, but the other factors that did not: integrity and relationship harmony. And of course, if you look at South Africa, you're looking at a country that is a mixture of a lot of different groups, including not just white, but also other native groups. One of them are wait a minute, let me think. I can't think of it. Anyway, they took over all of southern Africa, and the British had to fight these guys in order to take over that area, and they did. Of course, the British won, and then the Dutch moved in, and that's what South Africa was. It was the British and Dutch kind of mixed together, trying to keep all the native populations from destroying them. The Zulus. Some studies in other languages reveal evidence for factors in addition to the big five. Other studies sometimes do not find evidence for all five of the big five traits. In particular, openness to experience is the trait that emerges the least consistently in studies conducted in other languages. And this may be because openness to experience has to do with that desire to see new things. When we're talking about Eastern Europe, this is Romania. That's the Romanian flag. We're talking about when we're talking about Eastern Europe. These are people that had the opportunity to immigrate to someplace else, to someplace with more freedom, and they didn't do it. And the reason they didn't do it is because they had very little openness to experience. They had very little desire to be to allow themselves to be someplace else where uh, where their survival might be threatened. They would rather stay under somebody's thumb in Eastern Europe than they were than to move someplace where they would have more freedom. So we see this, we see this personality trait as only important in the United States. And of course, people in the United States, other than the indigenous people, are all immigrants, and they moved from one place to another. They got out of their comfort zone wherever they were, however uncomfortable or comfortable it was, to come to a place where they had to fight and scratch and claw for survival. And of course, that takes curiosity. It takes the desire for something else, and that is the openness to experience that we're talking about here. The north central Great Plains, especially around Minnesota and Wisconsin, is the epicenter for the friendly and conventional cluster, as residents are the highest in the country for the traits of extroversion, agreeableness, and conscientiousness. And I live right here in Iowa. The people here are really, really friendly. And that's one of the reasons why I am here instead of here, because these people are really friendly. We really enjoyed. We lived before. Okay. So I was born in Indiana, and then we moved to. I joined the Air Force, and I immediately moved to Texas. I was in San Antonio, and then I was trained in Wichita Falls, which is right there. From Wichita Falls, I went to. Oh, there's there. Okay, I went to Dayton, Ohio. From Dayton, Ohio, I went to where did I go from? Oh, Lubbock, Texas. And from time to time, I had to fly from one place to another, and we won't go into that. But okay, so here I am in Lubbock, Texas. And from Lubbock, Texas, I went to Germany, West Germany, and we were there for 3 years. Then we got my next assignment was in Omaha, Nebraska, right there. And then I got out of the service and we moved to California, to Riverside, California, March Air Force Base. From March Air Force Base, we moved back to Omaha. From Omaha, we stayed there for 7 years. Then my wife went where did she go? She went to Japan, no, Korea. Wait a minute. Then we moved to Oklahoma from Omaha. We moved to Oklahoma, and from Oklahoma, my wife went to Korea, and in order to get out of the command that we were in, she had to go to Japan. So we were in Japan, and then we had to come back, and we moved to Mississippi, and from Mississippi we moved back to California, to Santa Monica, Northridge. From Santa Monica, we went to Washington, D.C., and we lived in Maryland. Yeah, Washington, D.C. is right there. From here, we went back to Wichita Falls, Texas. And from Wichita Falls, Texas, we went up to Montana to the Fort Belknap Reservation, which is about right there. And from there, we came here to Iowa. I was teaching at Fort Belknap, and then I lost that job, and I came to Ashford, went to Ashford in Clinton, Iowa, and Ashford closed, and then I came here, and there you go. So Arizona and Iowa are the last two places that we've been. Anyway, okay, so people are really nice here. That's really kind of fun. They are extroverted, they're agreeable, and they are conscientious. Okay. The western states, from Oregon down to Arizona, house the relaxed and the creative cluster, where there is the lowest neuroticism and the highest openness to experience. So, congratulations. You guys are here, about right there. The northeastern states, especially New York and Massachusetts, are the home to the temperamental and uninhibited cluster, where people score the highest on neuroticism and the lowest on conscientiousness. So they're kind of grouchy over there. They don't pay a lot of attention to people other than themselves. They tend to focus on their own problems. Really kind of an interesting place. So you guys live in a pretty nice place. And that is the end of the lecture. Okay, so I'll stay safe and I'll see you guys next week. I'll talk to you guys.